The intelligence report landed on the desk at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, in early September 1944. An analyst had compiled data from bomber reconnaissance, captured documents and resistance networks across occupied Europe. German synthetic fuel production had collapsed. The numbers were stark, from over 300,000 tons per month in spring to perhaps 20,000 tons now, after months of precision bombing against refineries and chemical plants. The Wehrmacht needed 250,000 tons monthly just to maintain operations. The math was simple, brutal, and seemingly decisive. General Dwight Eisenhower read the assessment with the measured calm that defined his command style. He'd spent years managing logistics, understanding that modern war ran on petroleum as much as courage. The implications seemed clear. Germany was running dry. The war might end by Christmas. But something nagged at him as he reviewed deployment plans for the autumn offensives. The German army kept fighting, kept counterattacking, kept moving forces with a speed that shouldn't be possible for a military running on fumes. Either the intelligence was wrong, or the Germans were operating on desperation and fumes in ways the analysts couldn't quite model. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, commanding 12th Army Group, received similar intelligence assessments at his headquarters in Luxembourg. He'd built his reputation on methodical planning, on understanding the unglamorous reality that armies moved on trucks and tanks moved on fuel. The reports suggested Germany was finished. The numbers said so. The bombing campaign had worked. Yet German units still maneuvered, still defended, still launched local attacks that required fuel, ammunition, coordination. Bradley discussed it with his intelligence chief, Brigadier General Edwin Sibert. The conclusion seemed obvious. Germany must have hidden reserves, stockpiles the reconnaissance hadn't found, or perhaps the estimates of their consumption were too high. Neither man seriously considered what the Germans were actually doing, cannibalizing their entire military infrastructure, stripping training units and rear areas, hoarding every drop for one final throw of the dice. Through November, as American forces pushed toward the German border through mud and rain and determined resistance, the fuel question remained an abstraction, a factor in planning, a reason for optimism, but not yet a visible reality on the battlefield. German troops still fought from fortified positions. Their tanks still appeared, though in smaller numbers. Their trucks still moved supplies, though perhaps more slowly. The intelligence kept flowing in. A captured German officer revealed that his unit had received no fuel allocation for 3 weeks. Resistance fighters reported trains sitting idle on sidings, unable to move. Reconnaissance photos showed synthetic fuel plants in ruins. Their production halls collapsed under the weight of American bombs. At 3rd Army Headquarters, Lieutenant General George Patton studied maps with his characteristic intensity. His army had raced across France in August, consuming fuel at a rate that terrified the logistics officers. Now, ironically, it was American fuel shortages that constrained his advance, not German resistance. The supreme irony wasn't lost on him. His tanks sat idle for lack of gasoline while intelligence insisted the Germans faced the same crisis. "If they're out of fuel," Patton growled to his staff, "why are they still shooting at us?" It was a fair question. The answer lay in understanding the difference between strategic exhaustion and tactical capability, between a military that couldn't sustain operations and one that could still concentrate forces for brief, violent efforts. The Germans were masters of this kind of warfare now, husbanding their remaining fuel for moments that mattered, accepting immobility everywhere else. December 16th, 1944. 5:30 in the morning. The German artillery barrage that announced the Ardennes offensive shattered more than the winter quiet along the thinly held American lines in Belgium and Luxembourg. It shattered the comfortable assumption that Germany was finished, that fuel shortages had rendered them incapable of major operations. The first reports that reached Bradley's headquarters seemed impossible. A major German attack? Across a front of nearly 80 miles? With how many divisions? The numbers kept growing as the morning progressed. 5 divisions, 10 divisions, 20 divisions, armor and infantry, attacking in force, breaking through in multiple locations. Eisenhower received the news at Versailles with the same calm he brought to every crisis, but his mind raced through the implications. This wasn't a local counterattack. This was an offensive, a real offensive, requiring fuel and ammunition and coordination at a scale that shouldn't be possible for an army supposedly running on empty. The question formed immediately. Where did they get the fuel? The answer came in pieces over the following days, assembled from prisoner interrogations, captured documents, and the grim evidence of German objectives. The plan wasn't just to break through American lines. It was to reach the Meuse River, drive to Antwerp, split the Allied armies. And critically, explicitly, the plan depended on capturing American fuel dumps along the way. At 1st Army headquarters in Spa, Belgium, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges faced an immediate crisis. The town sat near massive American fuel dumps, millions of gallons stored in jerry cans and barrels, enough to keep the entire 1st Army mobile for weeks. The German spearheads were driving straight toward them. The lead German formation, Kampfgruppe Piper, had already reached Stavelot, just miles from Spa. Their commander, SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Piper, had been told explicitly that his advance depended on capturing American fuel. His tanks and half-tracks carried enough for perhaps 100 miles of combat operations. To reach the Meuse, to sustain the offensive, he needed those dumps. American engineers worked frantically to evacuate or destroy the fuel stocks. At the Stavelot dump alone, over 2 million gallons sat vulnerable. Some was evacuated, some was destroyed. But in the chaos of the breakthrough, with German tanks already entering the town, thousands of gallons fell into German hands. Piper's men refueled their vehicles with American gasoline, the supreme irony of the offensive made manifest. German tanks running on American fuel, driving deeper into American lines, sustained by the very logistics network they were trying to destroy. But it wasn't enough. It was never going to be enough. Bradley received the intelligence assessments as the battle developed. Captured German officers, interrogated immediately, revealed the fuel situation with surprising candor. They'd been told to capture fuel dumps. Their units had fuel for 3 days of combat operations, perhaps 4 if they were careful. After that, they depended on captured stocks. The realization hit Bradley with the force of revelation. This wasn't an offensive despite fuel shortages. This was an offensive because of fuel shortages. Germany had scraped together enough fuel for one massive effort, gambling everything on a breakthrough that would capture the resources to sustain itself. It was brilliant and desperate and ultimately doomed. Eisenhower grasped the implications immediately when Bradley briefed him. The Germans weren't stronger than intelligence had suggested. They were weaker, more desperate. This offensive represented the concentration of their last reserves, fuel and formation stripped from every other front, hoarded for this single throw. If it failed, they'd have nothing left. The question became, could they make it fail fast enough? Through the forests of the Ardennes, the evidence of Germany's fuel crisis became impossible to ignore. American forces counterattacking into the German flanks found abandoned vehicles everywhere. Tanks with empty fuel tanks, sitting where they'd run dry. Trucks pushed to the roadside, out of fuel, their crews long gone. Half-tracks and armored cars scattered through the woods, immobile, useless. Patton's 3rd Army, wheeling north in a remarkable 90-degree turn to strike the southern flank of the German penetration, encountered German units that couldn't maneuver, couldn't reposition, couldn't escape because they lacked the fuel to move. His tankers reported the bizarre experience of finding German armor in defensive positions, well sighted and determined, but unable to relocate when outflanked. They fought where they stood because they couldn't retreat. "They're not an army anymore," Patton told his staff as the counter-offensive gained momentum. "They're a collection of strong points that can't support each other." It was harsh, but accurate. The German offensive had created a bulge in American lines, but the bulge was filled with units that had expended their fuel reaching their current positions. They could defend, they could die in place, but they couldn't maneuver, couldn't concentrate, couldn't respond to American counterattacks with anything except local resistance. By early January 1945, as American forces compressed the bulge from north and south, the full scale of Germany's fuel desperation became undeniable. Prisoners spoke openly about fuel shortages. Captured documents revealed allocation systems that provided units with fractions of what they needed. The synthetic fuel plants, bombed repeatedly through the summer and fall, were producing almost nothing now. Major General J. Lawton Collins, commanding 7th Corps in the northern shoulder of the bulge, watched his forces advance past hundreds of abandoned German vehicles. His intelligence officers compiled counts: tanks, trucks, half-tracks, artillery tractors, all abandoned for lack of fuel. The numbers grew into the thousands. At a commanders' conference in late January, Eisenhower addressed his army group and army commanders with a new understanding of the strategic situation. The Ardennes offensive, costly as it had been in American casualties, had achieved something no Allied operation could have managed. It had forced Germany to expend its last fuel reserves in a failed gamble. "They shot their bolt," Eisenhower said, using the phrase that would define his assessment of the offensive. "They concentrated everything for one effort, and it wasn't enough. Now they have nothing left." The intelligence confirmed it. German fuel production had dropped below 10,000 tons per month. The Wehrmacht needed 25 times that amount for normal operations. The math was no longer theoretical. It was visible in every abandoned vehicle, every immobile division, every German unit that couldn't redeploy to meet new threats. Bradley's staff prepared assessments for the spring offensives, and the fuel factor dominated every calculation. German units wouldn't be able to conduct mobile defense. They couldn't shift reserves quickly to threatened sectors. They couldn't launch counterattacks at operational scale. The army that had conquered most of Europe through speed and maneuver was now anchored to defensive positions by empty fuel tanks. Patton, characteristically, wanted to exploit this immediately. "Give me the fuel, and I'll be in Berlin in 10 days, he told anyone who would listen. It was hyperbole, but the underlying point was sound. American mobility now represented an overwhelming advantage. German forces could only fight where they currently stood. The spring offensives confirmed everything the generals had realized. When American and British forces crossed the Rhine in March, German resistance, though often fierce locally, couldn't coordinate at operational level. Units fought in isolation, unable to support each other, unable to reposition, unable to retreat in good order. Major General Maurice Rose, commanding the 3rd Armored Division in 1st Army's drive across Germany, reported a surreal experience. His tanks advanced dozens of miles some days, encountering German units that fought briefly, then collapsed, unable to withdraw, unable to escape. His tankers found German vehicles abandoned in perfect working order, simply out of fuel. On March 30th, Rose was killed by German tanks near Paderborn, but his division continued the advance that exemplified the new reality. American armor moved freely across Germany, while German armor sat immobile, dangerous when encountered but unable to maneuver, unable to concentrate, unable to do anything except defend and die. The evidence accumulated into an overwhelming picture. Intelligence officers compiled reports from every front. German vehicles abandoned in place, German units reporting no fuel allocations, German commanders surrendering because their forces couldn't retreat. The synthetic fuel plants were rubble. The natural oil fields in Romania had been lost to the Soviets. The transportation network was shattered by bombing. Germany was fighting on fumes and desperation. At SHAEF headquarters, Eisenhower's staff prepared assessments of German capabilities that read like obituaries. The Wehrmacht could still fight defensively. It could still inflict casualties, but it couldn't maneuver, couldn't concentrate, couldn't do any of the things that had made it the most formidable military force in Europe for 5 years. Lieutenant General Lucian Truscott, commanding 15th Army Group in Italy, reported similar conditions on his front. German forces in northern Italy, cut off from fuel supplies, were increasingly immobile. Their defensive positions were formidable, their soldiers still determined, but they couldn't reposition when outflanked, couldn't launch counterattacks, couldn't escape encirclement. The fuel crisis had reduced the German military to a collection of static defenses, each dangerous in isolation, but unable to support each other, unable to create a coherent front, unable to respond to Allied penetrations except with local resistance. By April, as American forces drove deep into Germany from west and south, while Soviet forces closed from the east, the fuel situation had become catastrophic beyond anything the earlier intelligence had predicted. German units were literally immobile. Tanks sat in defensive positions not because it was tactically sound, but because they couldn't move. Trucks were abandoned on roads, out of fuel, blocking retreating columns. Artillery pieces were left in place because the tractors that moved them had no fuel. Bradley, touring the front lines in early April, saw the evidence everywhere. A German tank battalion, intact and well-equipped, had been captured without significant resistance because the tanks couldn't move. A motorized infantry division had surrendered en masse because it couldn't retreat and saw no point in dying in place. An SS Panzer division, once the elite of German armor, was found with its tanks dispersed in woods and villages, each one a static pillbox because there was no fuel to concentrate them. "It's not a military force anymore," Bradley told his staff. "It's a museum of military equipment scattered across the countryside, waiting to be collected." The assessment was clinical but accurate. The German army had been reduced to its component parts, each piece still potentially dangerous but unable to function as a whole, unable to maneuver, unable to concentrate, unable to do anything except wait for the end. Patton's Third Army raced across southern Germany and into Czechoslovakia and Austria, covering distances in days that would have taken weeks against a mobile enemy. His tankers reported the strange experience of advancing through enemy territory without encountering organized resistance, finding instead scattered German units that fought briefly, then surrendered, unable to retreat, unable to regroup, simply waiting for capture. At one point, Patton's forces advanced over 50 miles in a single day, an achievement that would have been impossible against an enemy capable of mobile defense. But the German forces in their path couldn't reposition to block them, couldn't concentrate to counterattack, couldn't do anything except defend isolated positions that were quickly bypassed. The final weeks of the war in Europe became a race between American, British, and Soviet forces to occupy German territory, with German resistance increasingly irrelevant to the outcome. The Wehrmacht still existed on paper, still had millions of men under arms, still possessed thousands of armored vehicles and artillery pieces. But it couldn't move them, couldn't concentrate them, couldn't employ them as a coherent military force. Eisenhower, in his final report on the European campaign, devoted significant attention to the fuel crisis and its impact on German capabilities. The bombing campaign against synthetic fuel production, he concluded, had been perhaps the most decisive single factor in Germany's defeat. Not because it stopped them from fighting, but because it stopped them from maneuvering. "A modern army without fuel," he wrote, "is not an army at all. It's a collection of isolated strong points, each capable of local defense, but incapable of mutual support, incapable of concentration, incapable of maneuver." The German army in the final months of the war was exactly this: dangerous in isolation, helpless as a whole. Bradley, in his own post-war reflections, focused on the Ardennes offensive as the moment of revelation. Before December 16, the fuel crisis had been an intelligence assessment, a factor in planning, a reason for optimism. After the offensive collapsed, it was an observable reality, visible in every abandoned vehicle, every immobile division, every German unit that couldn't escape encirclement. They gambled everything on one offensive, Bradley wrote, and when it failed, they had nothing left. The fuel they had hoarded for the Ardennes was gone. The reserves they'd stripped from other fronts were destroyed or captured. After January 1945, they weren't fighting to win. They were fighting because they couldn't retreat. Patton, characteristically, was more blunt in his assessment. In a letter to his wife in late April, as his forces pushed into Austria, he wrote about the surreal final weeks of the war. "The Germans are finished," he wrote. "Not because we beat them in battle, though we did, but because they can't move. Their tanks sit in fields like monuments. Their trucks line the roads, abandoned. They're an army on foot, trying to fight a mechanized war, and it's pathetic." The statistics compiled after Germany's surrender confirmed everything the generals had observed. German fuel production in April 1945 was less than 5,000 tons, roughly 2% of what the Wehrmacht needed for normal operations. Thousands of German armored vehicles were captured intact, simply out of fuel. Entire divisions surrendered because they couldn't retreat and saw no point in dying in place. The Allied bombing campaign against synthetic fuel production, combined with the loss of Romanian oil fields to the Soviets, had achieved what no single battle could accomplish. It had immobilized the German military. The army that had conquered most of Europe through speed and maneuver had been reduced to static defense, unable to respond to Allied penetrations, unable to concentrate forces, unable to do anything except fight and die in isolated positions. In June 1945, at a conference of Allied commanders reviewing the campaign, Eisenhower returned to the fuel question. Intelligence officers presented the data: German fuel production by month, German fuel consumption, the growing gap between supply and demand. The charts showed the collapse clearly, the point in late summer 1944 when production dropped below sustainable levels, the final plunge in early 1945 when production essentially ceased. "We knew they were running out," Eisenhower said, studying the charts. "The intelligence told us. But knowing it and seeing it are different things. The Ardennes showed us they were desperate enough to gamble everything on capturing our fuel. The spring showed us they had nothing left." Lieutenant General Walter Bedell Smith, Eisenhower's chief of staff, added context to the assessment. "The fuel crisis didn't just limit their mobility," he noted. "It shaped their entire strategy. The Ardennes offensive was designed around capturing fuel. Their defensive positions in the final months were chosen based on what they could reach with available fuel, not on what was tactically sound. They fought where they were because they couldn't fight anywhere else." The realization that Germany's fuel crisis had been even worse than intelligence suggested prompted discussions about whether the war could have ended sooner, if Allied commanders had fully understood the scale of German immobility. Could they have exploited it more aggressively? Could the Rhine crossings have happened earlier? Could the final offensives have moved faster? Bradley was skeptical. Even knowing they couldn't maneuver, he argued, they could still fight. Every position had to be taken. Every strong point had to be reduced. The fuel crisis made them predictable, made them unable to concentrate or counterattack. But it didn't make them harmless. The casualty figures supported his point. American forces suffered over 75,000 casualties in the Ardennes, fighting an enemy that was essentially immobile after the first week. The Rhine crossings and subsequent advances, though rapid by historical standards, still cost thousands of American lives against an enemy that couldn't retreat. Patton, predictably, disagreed. "If I'd known in December what I knew in March," he insisted, "I could have ended it by February. The fuel crisis made them helpless. We just didn't realize how helpless." It was an argument that would continue in post-war analyses, memoirs, and histories. But the core realization was shared by all the American commanders. Germany's fuel crisis had been more severe, more crippling, and more decisive than anyone had understood until the final months of the war. The Ardennes offensive, intended as Germany's last great blow, had instead revealed their final weakness. The fuel they'd hoarded for the offensive was gone. The mobility they'd achieved briefly was unsustainable. The advance they'd made couldn't be supported, and after the offensive collapsed, they had nothing left. American generals had spent months reading intelligence reports about German fuel shortages, treating it as one factor among many in planning operations. The Ardennes showed them it was the decisive factor, the constraint that shaped everything else, the weakness that would ultimately prove fatal. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the fuel crisis was so severe that thousands of German vehicles were captured intact, simply abandoned for lack of fuel. The Wehrmacht's final weeks saw units surrendering not because they were defeated in battle, but because they couldn't move, couldn't retreat, couldn't do anything except wait for capture. The American generals who'd spent the war managing logistics, planning operations, and studying intelligence reports had learned a fundamental lesson about modern warfare. An army without fuel isn't an army. It's a target, and Germany, in the final months of the war, had learned that lesson in the harshest way possible. The realization came in stages, from intelligence assessments to battlefield evidence to the overwhelming proof of thousands of abandoned vehicles and immobile divisions. But once it came, it was undeniable. Germany had run out of fuel, and with it, any chance of continuing the war.